So it's my pleasure today to welcome Jennifer Wenzel, who is a professor at the University of Columbia and a scholar of post-colonial studies and environment, energy, humanities. She has published a lot on this topic, the disposition of nature, environmental crisis, and world literature came out 2 years ago and was shortlisted for the Association for the Study of the Arts of the Present Book Prize. And she's the author of Bulletproof, Afterlives of Anti-Colonial Prophecy in South Africa and Beyond, which was also awarded a prize. And so her essays on post-colonial theory, environmental and energy humanities, memory studies, but also African and South Asian literatures have appeared in various journals, Modern Fiction Studies, PMLA, Post-Colonial Studies, and others. And she has held fellowships from the Mellon Foundation, ACLS, NEH, and Princeton University's David Center for Historical Studies. So today, Jennifer is going to challenge, in a way, this seminar by telling us about invisibility and visibility and the possibility of doing away with this diet. So the floor is yours, Jennifer.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and I'd also like to thank Alice Borrego and Eloise Lecomte for their generous invitation to speak with you tonight. It's a real pleasure and honor to talk with you about this topic of invisibility and silence with regard to questions of nature and the environment. And I see this talk not so much as a challenge to the framework, but a kind of thinking of its complications and implications for how we think, how we read, how we consider what is silent or visible. So in my remarks, oh, sorry, I meant to share my PowerPoint instead of just enjoying it by myself here. Excuse me, just one moment while I find my cursor. For some reason, I can't actually find the cursor. There, okay, got it. Okay, I've shared it, yes? Great.
It's coming, yeah.
Okay. All right, so in my remarks tonight, I will discuss several arguments in my recent scholarship that complicate the visibility-invisibility dyad as a framework for understanding how environmental crises attract or evade public attention. My fundamental concerns are to understand how power relations shape what and how we learn to see and to hear, and to understand how these regimes of perception help to determine what counts as nature, what counts as an environmental crisis, and even what counts as human. I'm drawing these remarks both from my recent book, The Disposition of Nature, Environmental Crisis and World Literature, and from two forthcoming essays about infrastructure. As you'll see, questions of invisibility and silence play slightly different roles in these arguments. In my book, The Disposition of Nature, I seek to complicate the problematic assumptions that seeing is knowing, and that knowing is a catalyst for caring, acknowledging, or acting to rectify suffering or injustice. So much thinking in the humanities is premised on what Stephanie Lemenager calls the relay of media to empathy to action. I share her skepticism about whether narratives and images work in such straight lines. I want to challenge the assumption that environmental injustice is best understood as a problem of invisibility, an assumption that is premised upon the Enlightenment ideal of bringing things to light as a catalyst for change. Among the things that the visibility-invisibility dyad ignores are the subtle interplay of invisibility and hypervisibility. Some things that seem invisible are actually hiding in plain sight, or even subject to surveillance. Other things that seem spectacularly hypervisible remain, for all practical and political purposes, unseen, unregarded, and unapprehended. Perhaps the best example of this dynamic of unperceived hypervisibility is the role of oil in modern life, at least in North America, the context that I know best. As I write in the introduction to Fueling Culture, oil is everywhere and nowhere, indispensable yet largely unapprehended, not so much invisible as unseen. With this notion of unapprehended, I'm drawing on Rob Nixon's discussion of apprehension in his book, Slow Violence. Nixon draws on the multiple English meanings of the word apprehend, which can mean both to understand and to arrest, in other words, to stop or detain. He uses the word apprehension in its multiple senses of perception, comprehension, and action in order to name the goal of making violence perceptible to the senses. Nixon argues that if we can begin to perceive slow violence, then it becomes possible to take political action to intervene and interrupt such violence. Nixon's notion of apprehension is important and suggestive, but I also want to consider ways of looking or modes of spectatorship where knowledge doesn't necessarily translate into action. Social inequality can manifest as scopic asymmetry, by which I mean the power imbalances at work in seeing and being seen. Looking and seeing are never neutral or innocent. As Nixon asks, who gets to see and from where? When and how does such empowered seeing become normative? And I would add, what does this normative vision hide or erase? Consider again that Enlightenment ideal of working against injustice by bringing invisible problems to light, by exposing them to public scrutiny. What this ideal ignores is the fact that the well-meaning exposure of harm can cause additional exposure to harm. This dynamic is an unintended consequence of the uncritical sympathetic benevolence that is often associated with the act of looking upon suffering, even and especially through the representational prostheses of photography, film, and print. These relations of power also entail dynamics of reflexivity. What does it mean to see oneself being seen? Sometimes a returned gaze can be an invitation to solidarity. This approach to questions of visibility and invisibility has important implications for literary and cultural texts as technologies of world imagining, by which I mean imagining the world and one's place in it, at scales ranging from the cells of our bodies to the planet as a whole. In the disposition of nature, I'm interested in what I call reading for the planet, an idea that I understand in several ways. One thing I mean by reading for the planet is to consider whether and how literature and the literary can be part of an environmentalist praxis. In other words, reading for the sake of the earth. Another thing I have in mind is to understand the planet or world or globe as an interpretive framework that raises questions of totality and scale. This means reading for images of the world entire as a conceptual, social, or planetary whole. But it also means reading for traffic lines of power and modes of inequality that can join and divide those wholes. It means charting a moral economy of distance that can obscure relationships between sites and subjects thousands of miles apart. The concerns about the limits of the visibility-invisibility dyad that I discussed a moment ago also lead me to understand reading for the planet in another very specific sense, shifting from seeing or not seeing to reading. The important question is not whether environmental justice can be seen, but instead whether and under what conditions it can be read, understood, and apprehended. This shift means thinking in terms of legibility and intelligibility rather than visibility in this work of apprehension as naming, understanding, and working against injustice. This is not to say that visibility and visuality have no place in my thinking. Photographs and film, along with prose and poetry that confront the politics and costs of looking, are important objects of analysis in order to tease out what visual culture as well as literature can tell us about imagining, reading, and the work they do in the world. One of the literary examples that I consider in the disposition of nature is a 2008 novel called Animals, People by Indra Sinha, which offers a fictionalized account of the long aftermath of the environmental disaster in Bhopal, India in 1984, when an explosion at a Union Carbide pesticide plant caused the catastrophic release of poisonous gas. The novel is set 20 years later in a fictionalized version of Bhopal called Kaufpur, which means city of terror in Hindi and sounds like city of coughs in English. The animal of the novel's title is also its narrator and a survivor of the gas disaster. He was just a baby on the night of the explosion, and he is called Animal because his exposure on that night to the deadly gas gradually deforms his spine so that he must walk bent over on his hands and feet. This novel is all about exposure in multiple meanings of the word, including physical exposure to toxic substances and financial exposure to economic losses, but also exposure in its visual and epistemological senses, the exposure to light through which photography operates, as well as the experiential sense of exposure as familiarity, knowledge, and awareness, which is at work in the journalistic notion of exposé, bringing misdeeds into public view. Conventional wisdom suggests that such journalistic exposure is an indispensable tool in environmental justice struggles. When communities are exposed to toxic harm, so the logic goes, the expose can force corporate polluters like Union Carbide to acknowledge something other than the risk to their financial interests. It is this logic of the expose that leads science and technology studies scholar Sheila Jasanoff to claim that Animals, People may have done more to revive international interest in Bhopal and thus to touch the conscience of the world than decades of legal or medical action. This claim may be true in the narrow sense of attracting or of renewing awareness about Bhopal. However, Jasanoff misses the novel's skepticism about the efficacy and ethics of touching the conscience of the world. If you've read the novel, this idea of touching the conscience of the world becomes rather creepy, in fact. And she also misses the novel's suggestion that the exposure of harm can cause further exposure to harm, what Alexandra Moore calls overexposure. In the novel, Animal challenges the equation between seeing and knowing entailed in the work of exposing injustice. In the 20 years since the disaster, he has become suspicious of the journalists, filmmakers, and researchers who come to help, so they think, so that Kaufpur has been reduced to a spectacle of wretchedness. Animal resents the prying eyes and condescending fascination of what he calls all you folk from America, journalists, filmwallas, photographers, anthropologists, who look at us with that so soft expression, speak to us with that so pious tone in your voice. For Animal, the problem is not invisibility, as readers might expect. Rather, it is hypervisibility, overexposure, being always the object of a gaze, or nothing but a spectacle. The novel describes these power imbalances as a scopic relation, a relation of looking, seeing, and being seen. Animal imagines the audience for his narration as a crowd of hungry eyes whose curiosity, he says, feels like acid on my skin. And I'll look at another passage in the novel. He says, whichever way I look, eyes are showing up. I don't want them to see me. As the words pop out of my mouth, they rise up in the dark. The eyes in a flash are onto them. I'm going to skip a little bit of the quote. He says, what I say becomes a picture and the eyes settle on it like flies. This pestilent image of eyes as flies echoes Animal's description of journalists as vultures, scavengers who, as he says, come to suck our stories from us so strangers in far-off countries can marvel there's so much pain in the world. Animal resents the abjection that curious outsiders expect him to perform in repeatedly telling the story of that night in 1984. He also resents the fact that, despite the many books that have been written about this place, he says, not one has changed anything for the better. Animal describes a strangely static economy of hypervisibility and compulsory narration, which packages pain for consumption elsewhere, but fails to bring change for the sufferers. Kaufpuri's are not invisible, unseen, nor silent, but they might as well be. There is a scene late in the novel that demonstrates the difference between silence and being unheard, which is analogous to the predicament of unseen hypervisibility that I discussed earlier. An American lawyer for the company responsible for the disaster comes to the factory in Kaufpur, and he is challenged by an old woman named Gargi. If you look at the top of this passage, Gargi asks, second line in the quote, "Mr. Lawyer, we lived in the shadow of your factory. You told us you were making medicine for the fields. You were making poisons to kill insects, but you killed us instead. I would like to ask, was there ever much difference to you?" Gargi's question tells us something about environmental racism as a differential exposure to risk that puts some communities on the other side of the species divide between humans and non-human animals. In his book, Slow Violence, Rob Nixon cites this passage as evidence that, in his words, some afflicted communities are afforded more visibility and more access to remediation than others. But I want to suggest that it is important to note the specific and poignant way that this dynamic holds true in the novel's narration, where Gargi's question remains, in effect, unheard. The company lawyer cannot understand what Gargi says. He asks a journalist to translate, and the journalist can only say, "I don't know how to translate it." When Gargi demands, as the passage continues, that the company must pay just and proper compensation for all the wrongs it has done, the journalist again translates by saying, "She's asking for money." And the lawyer takes out his wallet and gives her 500 rupees, less than 15 euros. What I'm trying to suggest, and what Nixon misses, is that Gargi remains invisible and unheard to the company lawyer even after confronting him. This fact is made legible in the incommensurable calculus of Indra Sinha's exchange rate, which converts her dignified demand for just compensation into the lawyer throwing a bill at a beggar. The point I want to make here is about reading and interpretation and about the relative visibility or silence of environmental themes in relation to other workings of power in the text that we read. This example points toward the subtle work of environmental imagining that paradoxically can be missed if we read only thematically, in this case, reading only for details about nature and the environment, as opposed to paying holistic attention to questions of form, tone, narration, and rhetorical situation. Gargi says powerfully and plainly what environmental humanities scholars want and need to say in the lesser language of academic prose. But the most important aspect of this scene is that the lawyer still cannot hear her. But notice also that what remains incomprehensible to the lawyer is communicated to the reader. Animal's narration registers and communicates Gargi's speech, thereby offering an alternative to the historical realm of activism and litigation represented in this scene. The effect of this scene is particularly powerful if readers can hear what the company lawyer cannot hear, as well as the fact that he cannot hear. Let me turn now to my recent work on infrastructure, a topic that has drawn my attention because of my interest in energy humanities. As my scholarship on the connections between energy and culture has increasingly touched upon such matters as oil pipelines, electricity pylons, and drilling rigs, I've become interested in understanding infrastructure as infrastructure, rather than merely taking it as the background to other questions. The past 2 decades have seen the emergence of critical infrastructure studies, inspired by anthropologists like Susan Leigh Starr and Jeffrey Bowker. In 1999, Starr called upon her fellow ethnographers to, in her words, study boring things. In other words, to think critically about the conventional wisdom that infrastructure was, in her words, mundane to the point of boredom. This idea of infrastructure as boring is related to what became known in infrastructure studies as the invisibility thesis, the idea that when infrastructure is working properly, when it is humming along quietly, unnoticed in the background, it tends to recede from social attention. In other words, well-functioning infrastructure tends to be understood as ordinary, boring, taken for granted, invisible, silent. The invisibility thesis has been challenged by scholars who seek to complicate these ideas about infrastructure's supposed invisibility by considering the many ways in which infrastructure isn't invisible and often isn't meant to be. For example, in the spectacle of monumental dams in places like India or Ghana that serve as symbols of post-colonial national arrival, right? So these stamps from Ghana say, "Look, a dam." With regard to energy humanities, I have noticed an unspoken ambivalence and contradiction about the visibility or invisibility of infrastructure, which has important implications for the imperative of transitioning away from fossil fuels. On the one hand, the task of making infrastructure visible is regarded by some scholars as necessary if insufficient in the work of creating broader public understanding of the importance of energy and energy systems, which for those who inhabit energy abundance tend to be taken for granted. This task of making things visible is analogous to defetishizing the commodity. It might also be described as something like following the pipeline, an infrastructural corollary to following the money. On the other hand, some scholars point to the infrastructure of fossil fuels as an obstacle to energy transition. This concern ranges beyond the inertia of built environments and sunk costs to the very ubiquity, saturation, and everyday normalized spectacle of the infrastructure of fossil fuels. Just imagine that all the world is the frenetically banal highway interchange captured in Edward Baczynski's Breezewood, Pennsylvania, staring us in the face as an obstacle to change, whether we benefit from it or not. To put it briefly, the contradiction regarding infrastructure in energy humanities is this. For some, it's the invisibility of fossil infrastructure that stands in the way of transition. For others, it's the ubiquity and inescapability of fossil infrastructure that is the challenge. And for many, it's the multiple forms of exclusion from fossil infrastructure and its benefits that demand a just transition. Yet the more we look around at gas stations and freeways and unwalkable neighborhoods and unventilatable buildings and digitalized everything, the more the possible alternatives seem impossible or recede from view, the more stuck we tend to feel. I don't mean to suggest that this contradiction is irresolvable. Like most contradictions, it's two sides of the same coin. No matter how it lands in impasse. That gap between knowledge and action, between understanding where we stand with regard to energy and environment, and being unable or unwilling to take action adequate to the situation. What interests me here is how this contradiction seems to revolve around questions of visibility, which are wrapped up in modes of cultural imagining, forms of representation, and habits of ideological blindness or disregard that literary and cultural critics are well positioned to interpret. The visibility of fossil fuel infrastructure is closely related to what I mentioned earlier about the everywhere and nowhere of oil. The unseen indispensability of oil escapes representation and perception in a different way than highways, gas stations, or pipelines, whose undeniable materiality poses a more unavoidable obstacle to abstraction or the withdrawal of social attention. In other words, it's harder for those things to be invisible than oil itself. In this sense, infrastructure offers a way of understanding the particular dynamics and relations at work in the distribution of the sensible and the regimes of perception associated with petro-modernity. Let me explore these ideas of the visibility and legibility of infrastructure by considering two examples. First, a brief lesson on how to look at a pipeline. In 2017, I attended the annual convention of the Pipeline Safety Trust, an organization that brings together representatives of the U.S. oil and gas pipeline industry, government regulators, and interested members of the public, that is, private landowners and indigenous people who have incurred losses because of pipelines on or near their land. I spoke on the first ever Energy Humanities panel at the Pipeline Safety Trust. In my paper, Not Seeing Oil, Imagining Risk, I argued that one common way of seeing oil is actually not seeing it, taking it for granted. I talked about the work of artist Mishka Henner, who searches Google Earth to find and compose images like this one of the Cedar Point oil field near Houston, Texas. Henner's way of looking at the ways that satellites look at the Earth is an aesthetic and political act. The beauty of this image has to do with scale, point of view, and abstraction. The contrasting colors and delicate shapes of petroleum infrastructure come into view only from an extreme distance, the view from space. To be close up on the ground or in the water, embedded and embodied within this place, would not be so beautiful. In other words, what and how you see depend on where you stand. For my Pipeline Safety Trust audience, I followed this brief aesthetics lesson in position, perspective, and modes of looking, how we learn to see, what not to see, and from what vantage point, with a discussion of visual composition and the relation between figure and ground. In aesthetic terms, ground is the part of an image that functions as context, which remains static and inert. Ground serves as the background for the real dynamic object of interest called the figure. Think of optical illusions like this one. Whether you see human faces in black silhouette or a white vase depends on which color the eye perceives as figure, which as ground. When we look at these above ground pipelines coursing through neighborhoods in the Niger Delta, what is figure and what is ground, people or pipelines? And how does the answer to that question depend on one's relationship to place and pipeline? Everyone hopes that a pipeline can remain as ground, static and stable, and not become the figure, the object of interest. Yet consider the differences between these images and maps or charts that depict in an abstracted mode the totality of the infrastructure comprising drill sites, pipelines, and export terminals in the Niger Delta. Pipelines are not to be measured merely in the number of miles between a drill site and an export terminal, along which something might go wrong, but hopefully won't. Instead, for those who live along a particular section of pipeline, it might as well be their entire world. Following the pipeline can name a gesture similar to commodity defetishization, then, tracing the social and geographic relationships between extraction and consumption. But the imperative to follow the pipeline could chart another sort of polity and map and community, not of countries and provinces, states and countries, but instead of vernacular habitations, linear communities joined by life along the pipeline. Such connections around fossil infrastructure might yield a real solidarity, a material solidarity, cutting across the territories that unite and divide us. The act of mapping pipelines can be a prelude to interrupting flows of oil. And I want to gloss this image just very quickly. It comes from an activist movement to stop what was called the Byhalia Connection, which was to be built through Black communities in Memphis, Tennessee, in the United States. So this is an activist map to kind of figure out where the proposed pipeline would fall and how close it was to various vulnerable sites, waterways, et cetera. And when I say that mapping a pipeline can be a prelude to interrupting flows of oil, that refers both to valve turning, the process of actually, like, activists going and turning the valves off. But this was a successful movement that in 2021 led to the pipeline developer dropping the project, right? So this is a map of a pipeline that was created successfully so that the pipeline would not be built. These figure ground reversals have the potential to flip the script regarding how pipelines are understood in terms of proximity and relations of power. For the pipeline safety trust audience, these conceptual tools of scale, perspective, and figure and ground served as an invitation to think differently about looking at a pipeline. This approach is similar to a foundational insight in infrastructure studies. I'm thinking of Jeffrey Bowker's account of what he called infrastructural inversion, in which infrastructures are no longer taken for granted as what he called invisible backdrops to social action. Instead, they are rendered visible as objects of concern precisely by means of what Bowker described as a figure ground reversal. Infrastructural inversion, in other words, infrastructure flickering into visibility and regard, can occur both in the lived experience of infrastructural interruption or failure and as a methodological shift for scholars thinking about infrastructure in a new way. By attending to the silent, unnoticed work of infrastructure, scholars have shown it to be dynamic, processual, and transitive. It makes things happen. But it would be a mistake to understand infrastructural inversion simply as making infrastructure visible in an on-off, either-or binary sort of way. Now you see the pipeline, now you don't. It's not merely now you see the pipeline, but also how you see the pipeline. This was my point at the Pipeline Safety Trust Conference. Infrastructure cannot be invisible to those charged with its maintenance and repair, and infrastructure is certainly not invisible to marginalized communities consigned to inhabit a state of intimate disconnect, a form of life that entails living in close proximity to infrastructure while at the same time disconnected or excluded from its circulatory systems. And I would say that those charged with the maintenance and repair of infrastructure see it in a different way than those who are excluded from that circulation. From this lesson on how to look at a pipeline, I want to turn now to my second example, a lesson on how to read for electricity. This example is drawn from a short story published in Drum magazine in 1956 by the South African writer Askia Mphahlele called The Lesanes of Nadia Street. I'll begin by reading a beautiful passage from this story. Outside there in the street, the young folk were dancing as if yesterday they didn't have a riotous beer spilling raid, as if tomorrow they might not have a pass and tax raid. For them, today was just a chunk of sweetened and flavored time. And in all this, there was a spirit of permanence, which they felt without thinking about it. For me, the phrase just a chunk of sweetened and flavored time captures a sense of the ordinary as a sustaining rhythm of community life amidst the horrors and indignities of apartheid in its first decade, when the legislated racialization of every aspect of life sought to eliminate any sense of permanence. At the beginning of Mphahlele's story, the narrator describes how the news of a couple's decision to get married travels through the neighborhood. The news had shot up and down Nadia Street like electric current, along the rows of dilapidated houses that stood cheek by jowl as if to support one another in the event of disaster. It had no fences to jump because there are no fences in Eau Claire. The flies hovering over the dirty water in the street seemed to buzz it around without being involved in the joy of it. The news had percolated through wooden and cardboard paper windows, lashed about from tongue to tongue in the greasy, sticky darkness of nuclear rooms. And Mphahlele vividly portrays both the buzz of neighborhood gossip and the grim details of overcrowded slum life. His Lezani stories are set in a fictionalized version of the Johannesburg neighborhood of Nuclear. And yet I had read and taught this story many times before I recognized the full import of that simile at the beginning of the passage, news shooting like electric current. Like most Black neighborhoods in mid-1950s Johannesburg, Nuclear probably did not have electricity. At most, some areas might have had streetlights for policing and surveillance, but not household connections for domestic convenience. The rooms in the story we read are dark. This unevenness of access to electricity was the reason why pylons were among the first targets of the sabotage campaign launched by the armed wing of the African National Congress and the anti-apartheid struggle in the early 1960s. Apartheid-era priorities for electrification included mining and manufacturing, the convenience of white South Africans, and surveillance and policing of the areas to which Black South Africans were forcibly removed. In the post-apartheid era, efforts to bring electrification of rural and previously underserved urban areas were made difficult by several factors. And I showed you this first slide here shows in increasing shades of blue households that the percentage of households that use electricity for domestic lighting as a primary source. And you can see in the second slide, the first map of South Africa is in 1996, and then you have 2001, 2011. So you have increasing electrification, but I want to talk about these several factors that complicated this project of electrification. These factors included post-Cold War neoliberal pressures that infrastructure should pay for itself by collecting fees from users, the incapacity of the national electric grid to meet the needs of all South Africans rather than merely a privileged few, and the susceptibility of the national electric utility, Eskom, to state capture, the South African term for shifting the priorities of the state away from good governance and towards systematic corruption and looting of public goods. Since 2008, all of these pressures on the electric grid have led to periodic load shedding, a phrase that denotes the more or less planned interruption of electricity when demand far exceeds supply. But the phrase load shedding also evokes metaphorical notions of state withdrawal from carrying the burdens of citizens' infrastructural needs. The social and historical life of the electrical grid in South Africa challenges fundamental ideas about infrastructure as boring. For many South Africans, both under apartheid and after, infrastructure is hardly ordinary in the sense of taken for granted, invisible. The sweet and unthought thrum of the ordinary on Mphahlele's Nadia Street, going back to this quote, the spirit of permanence they felt without thinking about it. That thrum of the ordinary is precisely that state of exclusion and intimate disconnect from infrastructure that I mentioned earlier. The buzz of electricity on Nadia Street exists solely in the realm of metaphor, in the as-if counterfactual rhythm of life without the inevitable daily raid. Mphahlele's commitment to the ordinary asks us to recognize that understanding South Africa only in terms of spectacular oppression or heroic resistance means that we ignore the less visible quotidian terrain of domestic life in which daily contact with the electricity or water meter, rather than the longer rhythms of the ballot box, is a site of politics where citizens interact with or are intimately disconnected from the state. My reflection on Mphahlele's story and its relationship to the history of the electric grid in South Africa is excerpted from an afterword that I wrote for a forthcoming book called The Aesthetic Life of Infrastructure. The book's editors, who are all literary critics, seek to reorient the invisibility thesis in infrastructure studies in order to consider instead the legibility of infrastructure. This pivot from seeing or not seeing to reading is similar to what I discussed earlier in my discussion of hypervisibility and reading for the planet. The important point here is that my lesson on how to read for electricity is a lesson that I myself had to learn. The likely absence of access to the electric grid in Paul story long escaped my attention until I started reading for infrastructure. More broadly, I want to emphasize that a reader's own capacity to plug into the grid as part of the sweet, unthought horizon of the ordinary shapes what they notice or don't notice on the page. In addition to complicating ideas about visibility and invisibility, I have aimed in the two sections of this talk to draw attention to the importance of interpretation and frameworks of legibility in shaping ideas of what is invisible or silent, whether in scenes of interpretation that are staged within texts, as in Gargi talking to the lawyer and Animals People, or with regard to the role of the reader or scholar in noticing what's on the page or in accepting or challenging infrastructure studies invisibility thesis. To put the idea most broadly, I'm arguing against the givenness of notions of invisibility or silence as fixed states or categories, and arguing instead for a reflexive approach, a granular, dynamic, multi-perspectival understanding of those regimes of perceptibility that shape who hears or sees, how they hear or see, and the effects of these apprehensions in the world. Thank you very much. Sorry, I'm having a hard time finding my cursor again. I would really like to stop sharing, but I can't.
Thank you very much, Jennifer.
Thank you. Yeah, this has never happened to me. Let me try something else.
Well, it doesn't matter too much if you can't. Oh, thank you. That's better. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for this illuminating talk. And I must say that I myself am a specialist of literature, and you, with your method, brought in so many things that are really thrilling. I was really fascinated by your talk. I think you showed in many ways how to reread our own concepts in literature, and at the same time you show how literature can help anthropologists or specialists of infrastructure studies to go on to go further. I was wondering, for instance, if the method you are using is in some ways inspired by Conrad's own method. Joseph Conrad, who wrote that the role of the writer was to make us see, to make us hear, and I think the third one was to make us feel. So I don't know if you know this quote by Conrad, or if it's something that may be helpful for you at some point or not.
Thank you so much for that question. Should I take that up now? Yeah, thank you so much for that, and I'm glad to hear that lots of the talk was meaningful to you. And I have to say, if I was familiar with a quote from Conrad, I have since forgotten it. So so what I'm thinking about when I look at it, having written it down, the role of the writer is to make us see, hear, and feel. I suppose I would assent to that, or that can be one role of the writer, to make us hear, see, or feel. And I think what I'm also saying is that the role of the critic is to help us to think about think about the work of literature among other modes of imagining in shaping how we learn to see, hear, or feel, right, in particular ways, and what can get left out of that, right? And so as I was talking, and you also said something that really resonated for me about rereading our concepts in literature and literary studies, and I think that resonates for me with a slightly different formation that I and other colleagues in energy humanities, thinking particularly of the modernist infrastructure scholar Michael Rubinstein, who have talked about the work of energy humanities, particularly in literary studies, as the work of rereading. And I kind of performed that a little bit in the talk in terms of, I've taught this Mphalele story, I don't know how many times. I teach it because it's useful in the South African literature class that I teach, precisely because of that quote about just a chunk of sweet and flavored time. But I had been reading that story for more than a decade before watch my own language kind of filled with the metaphors. I was going to say before the light bulb went on, right? And I realized that there are no light bulbs in the story, right? So that one can read over that simile. The news traveled like electric current without giving it a second thought. But I think it's a real invitation to think about how infrastructure works there only as a metaphor, right? And it's a metaphor that invokes and I think marks the place of that disconnect from actually functioning infrastructure. So that's just one example, I think, of the ways in which and I don't think this is unique to environmental or energy related studies. I think it's more the characteristic of the emergence of a new method, whether across a discipline or for a single scholar, that when we start reading in a new way, all of a sudden it turns out that texts are just full of the things that we're looking for, right? That we had never noticed before. And so that idea of rereading to see what has been there all along is a different kind of invisibility or silence, I think, that has to do with just simply not noticing, because the details that haven't been noticed aren't front and center in the ways of looking that Conrad tells us is the role of the writer, right? To make us see or hear. So I guess this is a kind of long-winded answer to your question, that I'm also interested in kind of what gets left out of what the writer invites us to see, right? What the writer invites us to hear. Thank you so much for that question.
Maybe there are some questions I don't see. Maybe Alice or Alice, you have a question?
Yes, I do, but maybe Esther wants to go first.
I can see.
You go first, Alice.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jennifer, for this wonderful talk. I like your idea of rereading, and I have a question about rewriting, but a very specific one maybe, because you talked about giving the priority to intelligibility over visibility, and it made me think of Alex Oniff, who says the opposite. In recognition, he says that we have to remember to recognize before cognizing. And so I was wondering if you could maybe comment on this paradox, because I couldn't help. He also says that he talks about reification, and for him, reification is this forgetting the primal recognition between two individuals, right? And so to me, while listening to you, I felt like there was a sort of backward evolutionary tendency to us, like almost a rewriting of our genetic code to overlook some things when we are actually meant to recognize our environment and people around, etc. So yeah, just throwing that out there. It's all very disconnected, but yeah.
Thank you so much for that. I think I can go partway toward an answer, and then I think I just have to ask a question. And here I should say I'm thinking a thought that that is a new thought. I don't exactly know what I'm saying, but at the last in the last part of your question, when you were talking about a backwards evolutionary tendency of overlooking what we're meant to recognize, I think that what that makes me think is simply sorry, I should just spit it out, but I feel very tentative about it. How one learns to see it all, right? How one learns to make sense of, how one learns to hear. It seems to me has to involve not only kind of the kind of muscular and cognitive work of focusing, but an enormous amount of filtering out, right? That in order to see anything, we have to decide to not see most things, right? And I'm just saying this as a person in the world, not as a person with any kind of expertise in neurology or vision or cognition. But I'm thinking of moments when one's consciousness is not working as it would, as you would like it to, and I think that there's a kind of loss of visual acuity that has to do precisely with not being able to ignore all of the things that one has to ignore in order to see in a meaningful way. So I guess I'm generalizing that tendency that I was talking about earlier in terms of the work of the writer and making us see and what gets left out of that. So that's generative for me. But I think I have to ask you about this idea of recognizing before cognizing. It's not an idea that I'm familiar with, but I assume what I hear in it is a kind of ethical, a recognition of ethical relationship that precedes something else. But maybe you can say a little bit more about what it actually is, so I can respond to it.
Yeah, thank you for your answer. And I do think that the amount of filtering out is absolutely on point, right? Because it's like selective memory. Your brain has to, compute. It can only compute a certain amount of information, and like maybe that's something to dig into. Yeah. But as regards recognition, it's absolutely a recognition of ethical relationships. Yeah. And ONIF is really much about recognizing the other, but very in an ethical kind of way, almost Levinasian kind of way. So yeah, it's absolutely yeah.
Yeah, and so I guess what I would say is that my concern and interest in the transitivity and the historicity of regimes of perception, right? By which I mean, like, how do we learn to see, right? In that kind of ideological way. What I would say about that is that those frameworks, I think, put pressure on that work of recognition in that ethical sense, and possibly even get in the way of it, right? So I think what I have in mind with legibility is a kind of reflexivity about like, how am I seeing or not seeing this, right? And so I don't think that I'm certainly not saying the same thing, but I think I have this a not dissimilar concern with not merely with marginalization, exclusion, invisibility, or silence, but also the words, the work that those terms can do in themselves, making that ethical connection impossible, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Esther, Perrine, you think you've got a question as well? We can't hear you.
Hi. I did the muting thing after 2 years. That's horrible.
Yeah.
Hi, Jennifer. Good to see
Hi,
you.
Esther. How are you?
I'm good. I was just wondering if pushing you maybe on reading for what is not there into reading for what is not there yet. Because I was very intrigued by your picture of the pipeline that was planned but was kind of stopped through mapping it in a certain way. And I was thinking that then adds also the question of when we read something, or when do we see something. And I was just this week, there was an article in a Dutch newspaper about the I don't know how you say this in English, but about the amount of distribution centers that are being built in the Netherlands. And it's kind of about the boxification of the Dutch landscape, because these distribution centers are being built in huge quantities. And this article was sort of an investigative journalism piece, maybe an expose, as in the novel. And they really they requested like plans, they requested permission, sort of planning permission requests, etc. And so they managed in this article to kind of draw attention to this phenomenon that is not actually visible yet, to the degree that it's sort of spreading and sort of creeping across the landscape. So I was wondering, especially thinking from the environmental humanities perspective, right? Also how this kind of when do we see something? When do we start reading something? And how is it that we're often kind of too late to start reading things? Because we only start reading them when they kind of have already invaded the landscape to the extent that we almost cannot ignore them anymore. And I really liked also the pylon photographs that you showed, because I think there's something similar, right? With electrification, it was like a process, but at some point it suddenly struck that there was something to read there, and also something then to resist. But I'm quite interested in the temporality of visibility and invisibility, particularly in relation to infrastructure, because it's so often seen as not important or not interesting and not aesthetically pleasing, which is particularly the case with these distribution centers. Because, I mean, I think some artists have tried to make kind of artworks of it, but there's very little aesthetic pleasure to be found in these very homogeneous boxes.
Thank you so much for that, Esther, and I really I appreciate the the compliment to what I was saying about rereading and discovering what has been waiting for us all the time, right? Your idea of reading for what is not there yet. What your example of this kind of forecast or kind of images of what the future of the Dutch landscape will look like makes me think of most immediately is an article that my mother sent me from the American National Geographic magazine, which is kind of a mainstream kind of like pictures of nature and things. And it was it was an expose of Manhattan and the row of super tall buildings that were going to be built along the south edge of Central Park. And it was, I think, exactly the same thing, and that I had no idea this was happening. and basically, so the visualizations of what Manhattan would look like, by I suppose 2025 or something like that, not that long from now, was temporally very interesting in terms of my own discovering as a citizen and a Manhattanite, basically what the landscape already looked like, even though I couldn't, I could look and those buildings aren't there, but they are there, right, for all practical purposes. And I think the question becomes, for activism, what modes of visualizing and imagining can possibly block those things that for all intents and purposes are already there, even though they're not, right? So how can we see them in a new way? And I think what I'll say, just as an aside, it was a visit to the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg. I'm not sure, I think it may have been in 2014, where I saw a photograph of one of those down pylons, and it was something I knew nothing about. This phase of the anti-apartheid struggle. I mean, I'm a South Africanist. I teach the literature of anti-apartheid, but I did not know about this. And there's something about that image of the downed pipeline, the downed electric pylon, that is just so jarring, and I think that there is a certain kind of anthropomorphism of the pipeline. They look like people, and so to see one on its side, I think just really, for me as a viewer of a photograph 50 years later, for the tiny human figures gathered around those down pipelines, I think it may be an example, actually, of a kind of phenomenon that I was like longing for just a moment ago, like how to intervene against those, your boxes or my, super tall buildings, to see with the down pylon the idea that things could be different. And the last thing I would say for now about this dynamic that you're asking me to think about, and it's something that I know is going to stick with me, is a feeling that I can say that I have been having for years, and maybe having a little less of now, and that is, to look around wherever I am, and to think about the ways in which it will be different in a climate change future, right? And Ivan Illich, has this phrase, the shadow that the future throws, and he's talking about different things, but that I'm going to borrow that phrase, the shadow that the future throws. And the reason that I think I'm doing that a little bit less is that those shadows are more and more actual. But so we're talking about kind of different scales of things, the ways that the future is or is not visible or imaginable. And I think that one major challenge, as I've said, is to find modes of visualizing and imagining that actually can be a lever on those features. So thank you so much, Esther. As I said, I have much more. Well, right now I don't have more to say, but I have more I would like to think. So I really appreciate the provocation.
We're not hearing you, Professor Régnier.
Yes, I think your microphone is off for now.
I was going to say that Gero had his microphone off, but I had mine off as well.
Okay, well, that's a great one.
Because Gero wants to ask a question. From
Absolutely.
What I can see.
Yeah, thank you, Christine, and thank you so much, Jennifer, and apologies for the wobbly video. I'm really intrigued by, you know, how you managed to pull together so many threads, you know, in current critical theory and political issues, and, you know, moved from invisibility, visibility to the question of legibility. And I have a question that connects to Lisa's question from earlier, the question of recognition and the problem of kind of how that links to methodologies, really. I'm thinking in particular of Felsky's point of, you know, trying to read for recognition and the way that she's reading Honneth, and that she also seems to be quite sympathetic to ideas of surface reading in some ways, right? I mean, obviously it's an ongoing and very much disputed field. But I'm wondering about how you would link your notion of legibility to the question of the surface and surface reading as a methodology, particularly, of course, in the artwork that you showed of the pipeline, where and especially the surface, you know, of the plan that has not yet come to be, with its temporal dimension. So I'm just trying to raise that methodological question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much for that question. And I'll just say from the outset that I haven't read the Felsky reading Honneth, so this is maybe something I should take a look at. But I can talk a little bit more, I think, about the question of legibility and surface reading. I'm not exactly satisfied with this answer, but I'll give it anyway. That my own work, I think, got increasingly interested in things that were underground at the same time that surface reading kind of bubbled up. One wants to look beyond one's own circumstance and interests in answering this kind of question, but to be serious and not merely glib. My interest in fossil fuels and not merely the fact that they have to be dug from deep underground, but also the profound and disjunctive timescales, including just massive spans of time and the very accelerated spans of time in which we have used them, and the force of their enfolding into capitalist economies and modernity in very uneven ways across the globe, mean that I am just deeply interested in historical granularity and materiality and how things got to be and what's beneath the surface. And I like Jameson. So, I mean, what I'm trying to say is that there's something really unsatisfying about some of the kind of core assumptions about surface reading. And with regard to infrastructure in particular, there's something really interesting about what infrastructure is and what infrastructure does, and how, as my colleague Brian Larkin says, infrastructure cannot be read off of its surfaces. Right. And the reason that infrastructure cannot be read off of its surfaces partly has to do with infrastructure itself being the kind of the stuff that is beneath, the stuff that is before, the stuff that enables what we see on the surface, right? So the kind of Jeffrey Balker gesture of infrastructural inversion, one way of describing it is to begin to peer beneath and behind and before the seemingly boring, silent surface of infrastructure. So I guess that's what I would say, right? That to me, legibility entails thinking about. I don't want to suggest that legibility entails merely ripping a surface away to look at the guts of the thing. I mean, I am a formalist to my core, right? And a close reader of toothpaste tubes, among other things. But I understand that formalism to be informed by an understanding of the historical forces that intersect with those forms. So I hope that's not merely a glib answer, even though
Yes,
it's also
absolutely.
a glib answer.
Great, yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm not sure whether there's another question, but if I may, could I ask a quick follow-up about, particularly about the Nixon's use or Nixon's term of slow violence?
Yeah.
Because I thought that was really really interesting with regard to the temporal scale, right? If I remember correctly, you know, his major point is that you know, slow violence is we're so used to these sensational outbursts of violence that we kind of disregard the slow violence of environmental, not change, but you know, exploitation and destruction, really. And I think that's really fascinating as well, and also an additional point for you know, including temporality in the questions of legibility. And also I would read it as another argument kind of against surface studies and pro kind of I'm not sure what the, I mean, invisibility studies obviously, but yeah, so yeah, I just that was ended up being more of a comment rather than a question. But if there's anything you'd like to speak to of that, that'd be fantastic as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right that Nixon, in calling our attention to attritional forms of violence that are not spectacular, that fit, you know, neither within the nightly news, if that's a thing even anymore, you know, don't fit on the nightly news. They don't fit within the time scale of a politician's term of rule, or whatever that's called. It's certainly another way of thinking about what is perceptible, right? And I think some of the things that he has in mind with slow violence are actually quite perceptible to people who live next to them, you know. And so I think his idea of slow violence is both about violence that happens attritionally and slowly, but it's also, I think, about what constitutes spectacle in the first place, you know. And so I think that his concept is really generative, and it's generative in a way that one can continue to think with and put more pressure on it. I probably shouldn't do this because I don't remember exactly. I don't remember the quote exactly, but I was a few years ago was working on an essay that was about geology and stratigraphy, and was looking at Charles Lyell's principles of geology. And he does this really amazing thing that kind of resonates with your kind of talking about Nixon and slow violence. And Lyle's talking about, you know, the relative speeds of geologic change. And this is the part where I'm going to get in trouble. But he talks about, you know, change that happens. If you were to look at change happening within a short time scale, as opposed to change that happens over a very long time scale. If you were to kind of flip the speed from one to the other, right, the effect would be equivalent to the difference between reading a realist novel and reading like the kind of outlandishness of romance, right? And I love that observation for, you know, first of all, because it's like literary through and through, but also for its kind of insight about how the speed of change is somehow in our ability to perceive it, right, is connected to what seems completely normal, taken for granted, unremarkable, you know, could appear within a realist novel, and what seems unimaginable, right? I'm not sure exactly what to do with that, and I'm sorry not to be more exact, but it feels certainly that it's, you know, in the neighborhood of thinking about what exactly slow violence means.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, so the deep time of the fantastic that becomes kind of the Gothic horror, right?
Yeah.
So that really fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for all your questions. Maybe Eloise, you've got one?
Sorry.
I can't hear you.
Exactly. I was just looking for my, you know, raised hand kind of thing. So thank you.
I think Jane Shemeshere, you wrote something in the chat. Maybe you can tell us about it if you can put on your mic, if it's possible for you. Otherwise, I read it, but maybe you can do it.
Yes, it should be fine. Sorry, I'm not working from home, so that's why I also have a wobbly screen. But thank you very much, Jennifer, for your paper. It was fascinating. And I don't really have a question, but I guess it's more of a comment. Your talk made me think of a collection of short stories by a writer called Deepak Unikrishnan, who wrote a collection of stories entitled Temporary People, which focuses on guest workers in the Gulf countries. And what I found particularly interesting is that the collection includes drawings of cranes and pylons. And as I wrote into the chat, some of the drawings, some of the pylons actually seem to even be made of human figures. Drawings of people, you know, as if they were embedded within the infrastructures themselves. And so I just found that there was this very interesting echo with what you've presented us, and especially what you said about, you know, infrastructures being the stuff that was beneath before, and what made it possible to, you know, to see the visible, but which were also interesting in the way they made us think about, you know, the rest, actually, what is not directly visible to us. And I tried to include a picture. I don't know whether it's yeah. So yeah, no, it's as I said, just a comment really, but I thought that it really connected well with what you said about, you know, the interrelation between human subjects and infrastructures, and how we couldn't think of some without thinking of the other.
Thank you so much, Jane. I'm so grateful for this, and I'm going to try to be sure that the link that I opened, that I can hold on to it. I don't think I have anything additional smart to say about what you've said, besides just to express gratitude, because I am somehow, you know, I managed to write these two things on infrastructure, but I find myself, wanting to write more. And I think that part of what you're pointing at is exactly what I hope to write about. And I don't know how much is there. I don't know what all there is to say about the fact that that pylines look like people, but I feel like there is something there, right? So I am so grateful for your reference to this collection, and I will certainly take it up and see what I see there. And yeah, I don't have more to say, except perhaps to share that I was on a train last week in France, and had a new kind of delight at seeing sorry, I've lost the word. Wind turbines, right? Mm-hmm. And the rape seed fields are all spring yellow, and the wind turbines are coming out of them. And I was a little bit sad that my train was kind of mostly a night train, so I'd missed the landscape. But it was amazing, because as the sun went down and the light faded, what I noticed was that not only could I see these massive wind turbines in the fields close to me, and I could see them, along a ridge in the horizon. But as the light faded, I could see that the blinking lights of the turbines. I could see, I don't know, it was like I could see hundreds, thousands, right? Just these really faint lines of blinking light. So yeah, that was delightful. I'm not sure that wind turbines are as easily anthropomorphized as pylons. I think that's okay. But yeah, thank you again for the reference.
Thank you.
Eloise, I think you want to add something?
Yes, I'm coming back. Yes, well, thank you very much, Jennifer, for broadening our very visible and invisible horizons. I actually had a very, very simple question that I'm almost ashamed to ask after all those very insightful comments, but I'm just going to go for it.
Yeah.
It actually came from when I was reading your book, in the introduction of which you mentioned imagining and unimagining, or the unimaginable, I think, if I remember well. And I knew the term imagining came back a lot in your answers to a lot of questions tonight. So I was wondering if you could tell us where you situate imagining as compared to legibility, apprehension, and all the terms that you mentioned in your talk when it comes to, potential deepening of this notion of invisibility. I don't know if you can say, well, the imaginable, the unimaginable, the visible, the invisible in environmental studies.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Heloise. And I was kind of hoping that you were going to ask me about unimagining rather than imagining. So, yeah, and the reason I say that is that, as I've been talking tonight, I kind of recognized that my argument in The Disposition of Nature about unimagining is actually very similar to what I'm saying here about ideas about invisibility and silence as the result of these human created historical regimes of perception. Because what I say about unimagining and the unimaginable is that they tend, when we say that something is unimaginable, right? And I'm just telling you what you read, but the connection might be interesting. We say that something is unimaginable, that tends to be, a label that we put on it. We put it on a box and we stop thinking about it, right? And what I am interested in instead is unimagining as a kind of transitive process, right? That creates blockages of cognition and recognition, right? To borrow the term here. So that how is it that something becomes unimaginable, right? As opposed to just thinking that we're over and done with it. And I think it's that same transitivity that I'm interested in thinking about how things become invisible, or how we come to think of them as invisible. In terms of imagining, I had, you know, as I was finishing The Disposition of Nature a few years ago, and was giving a talk from the introduction and conclusion of the book, I, how do I say it? I don't have to tell how it happened, but I realized that the final paragraph of The Disposition of Nature is in some ways identical to the final paragraph of my first book, which couldn't be more different, right? You know, my first book is deeply archival. It's grounded in a single site, mostly in Southern Africa, this prophecy that led to catastrophe among people who would soon be colonized. But what both of those paragraphs say at the end of both of those books is something about the importance of alternative imagining, the importance of imagining alternative possibility, and the idea that things could be otherwise, right? And so I think when I talk about imagining, what I've been saying in terms of the unimaginable, or what we take to be invisible or silent, are about the harms of modes of imagining. But I think I keep coming back to the idea of imagining because it's precisely, you know, the terrain of what Esther was asking about, right? Of how to perceive futures that aren't here yet and we don't necessarily want, and how to envision something else, right? And that is that is for me the kind of charge and the potential of a certain kind of imagining. But I think that, you know, going back to the question that Jero asked about surface reading, I suppose, and here I'm kind of thinking off the top of my head, I suppose part of the reason I want to devote so much attention to these forms of imagining that make me nervous, as a kind of discipline toward imagining alternative possibility, that I can, I don't know how to land this sentence, right? But what I'm saying is, it feels irresponsible and not very useful solely to kind of extol the imagination without counting the costs of centuries of imagining that in some ways have gotten us to where we are. Yeah. So thank you for the question.
Yes, thank you
so much, Jennifer. Yeah. I don't know if there are any other questions, or maybe we should close this session now.
I guess maybe.
No more questions? I don't think so. So I would like to thank you very much, Jennifer, for sharing your research with us and your thoughts. And it seems to me you are on a very rich track. And I couldn't help thinking while you were talking about the infrastructures with the gas pipelines from Russia to Germany, which is invisible, but very much moment. So maybe some artists will, sorry, my connection is very bad, but maybe some artists will in the near future tell us something about this and give you some more food for thought. And thank you also, Alice and Eloise, for this seminar, which is really very, very nice and gives us all food for thought.